3 hits on the door. No pause between them. Whoever it was, they weren't here to talk. I set my digital caliper down on the drafting table, the forged metal clicking sharply against the tempered glass surface. The dual monitors illuminated the dark living room, casting a pale blue glow over the complex topographic data and real-time barometric pressure models of the Cascade Range. The wind outside registered at 22 knots, rattling the single-pane glass of my rented duplex and forcing a bitter, freezing draft through the poorly sealed weather stripping around the window frames. The floorboards creaked under my heavy boots as I crossed the room. The brass deadbolt clacked loudly as I turned it. When the heavy oak door swung inward, the porch light cast a harsh, yellow glow over Sloane Davis. She was the chief executive officer of Apex Expeditions. She was also my employer. Her breathing was elevated, producing rapid, visible clouds of condensation in the freezing night air. Her shoulders held a rigid, locked posture, and her expensive leather boots were dark and soaked with melted snow from my unswept walkway. "You're fired," she said. She did not offer a greeting. She did not brush the accumulating snow from her shoulders. She simply extended a thick, sealed, manila envelope toward my chest. I looked at the heavy paper, then up at her face. The muscles along her jawline were pulled taut, fighting a fine tremor that had absolutely nothing to do with the dropping temperature. My thumb hovered over the envelope's adhesive seal, but I didn't take it. Her words didn't fit the established metrics of our professional relationship. My client satisfaction rating for the past 4 fiscal quarters sat at an unprecedented 99.2%, and I currently held the lowest incident rate in the company's 60-year operational history. Termination requires a formal human resources representative present and a 48-hour written notice per my executed contract, Miss Davis, I stated, keeping my voice entirely level against the howling wind. "Take the paper, Tadeo," she instructed. Her voice dropped an octave, carrying a raw, jagged edge I had never heard within the sterile, climate-controlled walls of the corporate office. She pushed past my shoulder, stepping out of the gale and into my living room without an invitation. She brought the sharp, metallic scent of pine needles and cold exhaust with her. "If you are an employee of Apex, the liability of what I am about to ask you to do falls entirely on the company's insurance policy. If you are an independent contractor, whose employment was terminated at exactly midnight, you are a private citizen acting on your own volition." I pushed the heavy door shut against the storm. The deadbolt clacked back into place, sealing us inside. She said, "Midnight," like a timestamp. My eyes went to the envelope resting on the counter. Liability. Not a breakup, an assignment. She needed a ghost on the mountain. "Client 402, I said. Sloane stopped pacing across my faded rug. She exhaled a long, shaky breath and dropped her heavy leather tote bag onto the hardwood floor with a dull thud. He ignored the turnaround time on the North Ridge. The storm cell hit early, exactly like your meteorological models predicted it would. He missed his 2:00 radio check-in. My brother, Vance, convened an emergency board meeting via conference call an hour ago. Vance is using this incident to trigger the gross negligence clause in my CEO contract. If a state rescue team is officially dispatched by morning, the negative PR will crater our quarterly valuation, and Vance forces the sale to the conglomerate. Client 402 was classified as a Class 4 risk, I pointed out. Crossing my arms over my thermal shirt to retain core heat, I submitted a detailed, 14-page risk assessment memo advising against his booking 12 days ago. "You signed off on the expedition anyway." "I didn't ignore your data," she corrected, taking a step closer. A slight micro-tremor shook her hands as she began unbuttoning her damp, insulated coat. "Vance overrode my veto. He has the board votes. He engineered this entire scenario. But Vance isn't the one who will lose the company tomorrow morning. I am. My grandfather's legacy gets carved up, liquidated, and sold for parts by noon. And you will be the convenient scapegoat for the poor logistical planning of the route." I turned my head to look at the topographic map still glowing brightly on my monitor. The tightly clustered elevation lines formed a steep, unforgiving maze of vertical granite and ancient blue ice. Client 402 was currently stranded somewhere around 11,000 feet. The low-pressure system moving over the range was intensifying rapidly. The survival probability for an amateur climber lacking proper bivouac training in those extreme conditions dropped by 14% every single hour. "You want an unlogged, off-the-books extraction," I verified, analyzing the logistics. I want the best high-altitude guide on this continent to pull an idiot off a mountain before sunrise, she specified, her eyes locking onto mine with a fierce, desperate clarity that demanded an immediate variable shift. I will pay double your annual rate directly out of my personal account. But you don't work for Apex as of 4 minutes ago. I have a dependent, I said, gesturing down the dark hallway toward the closed door of the second bedroom. I already called your neighbor, Mrs. Higgins, Sloane countered, without missing a single beat. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded, printed receipt, smoothing it out on the counter. I transferred $1,000 to her account for emergency overnight childcare. She will be here in 2 minutes. I stared at the bank receipt. Most corporate executives suffered total cognitive paralysis under severe, time-sensitive pressure, usually resorting to shouting orders without laying the necessary groundwork. Sloane Davis had built a comprehensive logistical contingency plan before even knocking on my door. I reached out, picked up the termination envelope from the counter, and slid it into a drawer. Mrs. Higgins prefers chamomile tea, not herbal, I corrected, turning away from her and walking toward my heavy, reinforced gear locker. Do not let the front door slam when she arrives. Leo is a very light sleeper. I spent exactly 4 minutes in my son's room. The ambient temperature was a steady, calculated 64 degrees. I adjusted the thick 600 fill-down quilt over his small shoulders, verifying his breathing was deep, rhythmic, and unobstructed. His stuffed bear was tucked securely under his chin. When I returned to the living room, Mrs. Higgins was standing quietly by the kitchen island, holding a steaming mug, nodding silently as Sloane whispered final emergency contact instructions. 72 minutes later, the paved municipal road ended, the tree line vanished into the darkness, and the wind started screaming violently against the reinforced windshield of my modified four-wheel drive truck. I piloted the heavy vehicle up the winding, unplowed logging roads, keeping both hands firmly gripped on the steering wheel to manage the precarious traction of the studded tires on the black ice. The cab temperature was set to an optimal 68 degrees to maintain blood flow to our extremities. I glanced at Sloane in the passenger seat. She was staring out the window into the pitch-black darkness, her posture remaining unnaturally stiff. She was wearing a standard-issue company parka. It was rated for base camp logistics and mild alpine conditions, not the unforgiving death zone of a high-altitude winter squall. Without taking my eyes off the treacherous, winding road, I reached behind my seat. My fingers found the heavy, foil-lined thermal mid-layer I kept sealed in the emergency kit. I pulled it forward and dropped it onto the center console between us. Your current layering system will result in critical core temperature loss within 40 minutes of exposure above the snow line, I stated, monitoring the dashboard thermometer as the external temperature plummeted. Put this on. She looked at the bulky, unattractive jacket, then at my profile. I'm fine, Tadeo. The heater in here is working. Data dictates otherwise, I replied, downshifting smoothly as the incline steepened and the massive tires slipped for a fraction of a second before catching the ice. Your shivering frequency is already elevated despite the ambient cabin heat. Put the layer on, or I will stop the vehicle, turn around, and terminate the operation before we even reach the staging area. She did not argue further. She unzipped her parka, the sound loud and sharp in the quiet cab, and pulled the thermal mid-layer over her head. The thick nylon rustled heavily as she settled back into the passenger seat. Thank you, she said quietly, pulling the stiff collar up around her neck to block the faint draft leaking from the window seal. It is standard equipment maintenance, I replied, watching the high-beam headlights cut through the swirling horizontal snow. A compromised extraction partner is a liability. I require peak physical efficiency to navigate the terrain. We reached the high-altitude trailhead at exactly 0140 hours. The wind was howling aggressively through the upper spruce canopy, measuring at approximately 30 knots. I moved to the tailgate and opened the dual weatherproof cases, the heavy steel hinges stiff and resistant with frost. I handed Sloane a pair of forged steel crampons and a heavy-duty Petzl climbing harness. I checked her gear meticulously. I ran my thick, insulated gloved hands over the steel buckles, pulling the heavy nylon webbing to the precise, exact tension required to arrest a human load during a vertical fall. I checked the locking carabiners, ensuring absolutely no ice blocked the spring-loaded gates. I did not ask about her comfort or apologize for the tight, restrictive fit. I prioritized her survival above politeness. He's carrying a secondary GPS beacon, Sloane said, holding up a ruggedized tactical tablet. The screen cast a harsh, unnatural blue light across her pale face. It pinged 20 minutes ago. The coordinates show him stalled precisely in the middle of the couloir. I leaned over to look at the screen. I noted the tightly packed elevation lines. I studied the surrounding rock formations and the wind flow patterns. I shook my head, my jaw tightening. The telemetry is wrong. Sloane frowned, tapping the heavy glass screen with a gloved finger. The beacon is military grade, Tadeo. It doesn't lie. The beacon transmits a radio frequency, I explained, pulling out my own physical, waterproof topographic map and a precision magnetic compass. The signal reflects off the sheer granite walls of the couloir, creating a massive multipath error in the satellite triangulation. Client 402 is an amateur. Amateurs do not stop in the middle of wind tunnels. Their biological survival instinct forces them to seek shelter, regardless of their route. I tapped my heavy index finger against a specific, curved contour line on the map. The nearest natural windbreak from a prevailing northerly gale is a shallow ice cave 300 meters east of that ping. She looked at my analog map, then back at the multi-million-dollar corporate tracking software. She powered down the tablet and slipped it securely into her waterproof chest pocket. East. My thighs burned. The wind kept trying to peel us off the ridge like tape. We climbed through the absolute darkness for 3 unbroken hours. The incline reached a punishing, relentless 45-degree grade. Our headlamps cut narrow, bouncing cones of stark white light into the swirling horizontal snow. I maintained a deliberate, mathematically calibrated pace, monitoring my oxygen intake and perfectly matching my rhythm to Sloane's respiration rate behind me. She was strong. She possessed a high VO2 max for someone who spent most of her time negotiating in boardrooms. But the severe atmospheric pressure drop was dragging heavily on her lungs, forcing short, shallow breaths. We reached a massive glacial traverse. A deep, jagged crevasse split the blue ice, spanning roughly 4 meters across a bottomless drop into absolute darkness. A fixed line from a previous summer expedition hung loosely across the gap, secured to aging, questionable snow pickets. Sloane stepped forward, unhooking her primary carabiner to clip into the old line. "Stop!" I commanded. My voice cut through the howling wind, sharp and absolute. She paused, looking back at me, her chest heaving as she fought for precious oxygen. "It's a static line. It's already anchored. We can save time. It has been exposed to intense UV radiation and extreme freeze-thaw cycles for an estimated 6 months," I said, walking toward her, my crampons biting deep into the solid ice with satisfying crunches. The internal nylon fibers have degraded. The braking strength is compromised by at least 40%. I dropped my heavy pack onto the ice. I tied fresh rope, checked the knot twice, and put my body between her and the rotten line. "I can tie my own anchor, Tadeo," she said, her chin lifting defiantly. It was a standard psychological defense mechanism. Dignity preservation in the face of profound physical exhaustion. "Your fine motor skills are severely impaired by the drop in core temperature," I stated. I took the carabiner attached to the front of her harness. My knuckles brushed lightly against the thick fabric of her jacket, a brief point of contact in the freezing, chaotic void. I clipped the new, secure line into her rig and locked the gate with a definitive, metallic snap. "Do not let ego override physics. I will cross first and establish a secondary anchor. You will follow on tension." "You're a robot, Bennett," she muttered, her breath pluming heavily in the bright, focused light of my headlamp. "Robots do not make calculation errors," I replied. I turned and approached the terrifying edge of the crevasse. I crossed the gap, the fragile ice bridge groaning deeply under my concentrated weight, the sound echoing down into the abyss. I secured the anchor on the far side using 3 20-centimeter titanium ice screws, driving them deep into the solid blue ice and equalizing the load perfectly with a sewn sling. I signaled her with 2 sharp, heavy tugs on the rope. She crossed. Her movements were stiff, her boots slipping once on a slick patch, but the tension on my line held her completely steady. She followed my exact path. We moved upward. By 0430 hours, the wind velocity exceeded 40 knots. We reached a narrow rock outcropping that offered a marginal, temporary break from the gale. Proceeding further in zero visibility across an exposed, knife-edge ridge was statistically fatal. "We establish a bivouac here," I announced, dropping my pack against the sheer granite wall. "The barometric pressure drop indicates the squall will pass in approximately 45 minutes. I deployed the ultralight emergency tent in under 2 minutes, anchoring the guy lines to the surrounding rock with heavy steel pitons. We crawled inside. pulling the heavy zippers shut against the roaring storm. The emergency bivouac was exactly 2 meters long and 1 meter wide. We sat back to back to conserve heat, our eyes locked on the zipper flap, listening intently for the wind shift. Survival dictated the conservation of energy, not conversation. The ambient temperature inside the tent was an unforgiving 12 degrees Fahrenheit. I unpacked the small butane stove and a titanium pot. I scooped clean snow from the small vestibule and ignited the burner. The blue flame hissed aggressively, providing a marginal psychological comfort, though its actual thermal output was negligible in this cubic volume. Vance has been planning this hostile takeover for a year, Sloane said quietly. The howling wind masked the volume of her voice, but the acoustic reflection inside the tiny tent carried the words clearly. He bought up the proxy shares through a ghost shell company. He just needed a public catalyst to prove to the board that I was unfit to run grandfather's legacy, this client dying on the mountain. That's his proof. I checked my watch. 130 seconds until the water reached a rolling boil. Client, 402, is not dead. His thermal mass is large enough to sustain core function for another 2 hours, provided my hypothesis regarding his shelter is correct. She pulled her knees tightly to her chest, her heavy boots scraping against the nylon floor. Why do you stay, Tadeo? With Apex. With me as a boss. You could guide anywhere in the world. You have the highest safety metrics in the entire industry. Consistency, I answered, watching the solid ice crystals melt into clear water. My son requires a stable geographical base for his educational and developmental routines. Apex provides a highly predictable schedule and adequate compensation to maintain that precise stability. Just data, she murmured, resting her chin on her knees, the profound exhaustion finally bleeding through her impenetrable corporate armor. I looked over my shoulder at her. Her lips were pale, severely lacking proper blood circulation. I reached into my waterproof supply bag. Standard operational protocol dictated consuming a high-calorie nutrient paste for rapid energy recovery.
That required 0 fuel to prepare.
It was the optimal, mathematically correct choice. Instead, I opened a sealed plastic bag containing premium Earl Grey tea leaves. It was highly inefficient. It required 3 extra minutes of precious fuel burn to steep properly. I knew, from observing her in the corporate office over the last 2 years, that she consumed exactly 2 cups of Earl Grey every morning at 0, 830, and 1,100 hours. I dropped the leaves into the titanium pot. I waited precisely 3 minutes, carefully monitoring the color of the liquid. I poured the dark tea into an insulated metal mug and handed it over my shoulder. She took the mug. She looked at the steam rising heavily from the dark liquid, the distinct scent of bergamot cutting through the sterile smell of cold nylon and ozone. She looked at the back of my head, her eyes wide in the dim, localized light. You brought tea. Loose leaf, she said. Hot liquid accelerates core temperature recovery by warming the blood close to the digestive tract, I said. I stared straight ahead at the nylon tent wall. You brought my tea? She corrected. She tried to sip without trembling. The metal rim clinked sharply against her teeth. I slid my heavy glove under the base of the mug, steadying the cup, not her. The severe tension in her jaw slowly smoothed out. Thank you. Drink it quickly. We move in 11 minutes. I watched the steam curl around her face and decided the extra fuel was a completely negligible cost for the healthy color returning to her cheeks. At 0515 hours, my personal satellite communicator vibrated aggressively in my chest pocket. I pulled it out. The liquid crystal display was sluggish in the extreme cold. It was an encrypted message forwarded from Sloane's loyal assistant down at base camp. Board moved. Deadline. Emergency declaration filed with state authorities. Helos launch at 0700. You have 105 minutes. I handed the device back to Sloane. She read the glowing screen. Her face lost what little color the hot tea had managed to restore. Vance accelerated the timeline, she said, her voice hollow, entirely devoid of its usual boardroom command. If the state search and rescue helicopters launch, it becomes public record. The gross negligence clause triggers. Apex is finished. I'm finished. The timeline is compressed, I stated, packing the hot stove away with sharp, precise movements, completely ignoring the heat against my heavy gloves. We no longer have a margin for error. We must locate the client and descend below the visible cloud layer before the helicopters achieve visual range. Is that mathematically possible from this extreme elevation? She asked, her eyes searching mine for a guarantee I could not provide. If my geographical hypothesis regarding the ice cave is correct, yes. If we delay to discuss it, no. We exited the tent. The squall had broken, revealing a sharp, cruel landscape of jagged peaks under a fading, pale moon. The wind had dropped to 10 knots. I set a punishing, relentless pace eastward along the treacherous ridge. Sloane matched it. She did not complain. She paid her physical toll in complete silence, proving her immense resilience with every heavy step as the snow crunched beneath our steel crampons. At 0545 hours, we found him. Client 402 was huddled in the exact shallow ice cave I had projected on the map. He was wearing an expensive, highly visible yellow mountaineering suit. He was shivering violently, clutching his dead tablet tightly to his chest. Finally! The man croaked as my headlamp swept over his form. He tried to stand, but his knees buckled instantly. I sent the distress signal hours ago. Where is the helicopter? Atmospheric conditions and low visibility prohibit rotary wing aircraft extraction at this elevation, I said, quickly uncoiling my rope and approaching him. Stand up. We are descending on foot. The man scoffed, waving a thickly gloved hand at me dismissively. I paid $100,000 for this summit attempt. I'm not walking down in the dark like a pack mule. I demand an air evac. Call the CEO. Tell her I want a chopper right now. Sloane stepped forward from the dark shadows, her headlamp illuminating her furious expression. I am the CEO, and you are trespassing on a closed, highly restricted route after completely ignoring 4 distinct turnaround protocols. Client 402 blinked, his sluggish, oxygen-deprived brain struggling to process her presence. Sloane? What are you doing here? Saving your life and my company, she snapped, tossing a spare harness hard at his chest. Put it on. He crossed his arms, leaning stubbornly back against the freezing ice wall. No, I'll wait for the real rescue team. You people are clearly incompetent. I assessed the variables. The client was experiencing early-stage hypoxia, leading to poor, irrational decision-making and aggressive behavior. An argument would consume valuable minutes we simply did not have. I stepped between Sloane and the client. I did not raise my voice. I lowered it, stripping it of all emotion. Your core body temperature is currently estimated at 94 degrees Fahrenheit, I stated, staring directly into his dilated, bloodshot pupils. In an hour, your heart will fail. The helicopter won't arrive in time. Put on the harness, or we leave you here. The data was absolute. The delivery was clinical. The man stared at my flat, unblinking expression. The blind arrogance drained from his face, replaced by a primal, terrifying understanding of his own imminent mortality. His shaking hands reached for the heavy harness straps. Rig him, I told Sloane, turning away to quickly prep the descent line. We moved to the edge of the steep couloir. The route down was a terrifying 60-degree pitch of hard-packed snow and treacherous blue ice. I built a quick lowering system rope, screws, pulley, then put Sloane on the backup line. Halfway down the massive pitch, the structural integrity of the ice wall shifted without warning. A sharp, deafening crack echoed through the narrow canyon. The primary ice screw fractured the surrounding surface, blowing a chunk of ice the size of a dinner plate completely out of the wall. The client slipped, screaming in terror as his full weight hit the rope dynamically. The sudden, violent force threatened to rip the failing screw entirely out of the wall, which would send him plummeting 300 feet to the jagged rocks below. Anchor failing! Sloane shouted. She threw her entire weight onto the secondary line, her boots scraping desperately against the ice as she fought to arrest his fall with her belay device. I lunged forward, slamming my ice axe deep into a solid seam of granite to my left. I grabbed the primary load line and wrapped it entirely around my right forearm, bypassing the failing screw. The client's body weight, 210 pounds, multiplied by the force of gravity, hit my arm like a concrete block falling from a building. The nylon rope burned violently through the outer layer of my jacket. The intense friction generated localized heat against my skin, smelling faintly of melting synthetic fibers. The bones in my forearm bowed under the immense tensile stress. I locked my shoulder joint, planting my crampons, turning my skeletal structure into a fixed, immovable anchor point. I have the load, I gritted out. The pain was severe, radiating up to my neck in hot, blinding flashes. I locked my jaw. Lower him on my tension. Go. Sloane looked at me, her eyes wide with the realization of what the rope was doing to my arm. Statistically improbable, I hissed through clenched teeth. Hold the slack. She didn't freeze. She took immediate, decisive command of the secondary line. She worked the rope with furious, terrifying efficiency, bleeding the line through her belay device, lowering the screaming client down the sheer ice face inch by agonizing inch until he finally reached the flat, safe plateau far below. The tension released violently. I uncoiled the rope from my arm. The sleeve of my jacket was completely shredded, the skin underneath heavily abraded and seeping warm blood into the freezing air. I ignored it. I calculated the remaining distance. We had exactly 40 minutes before the 0700 helicopter launch. We reached base camp at 0645. The sun was just breaking over the jagged horizon, painting the vast snowfields in a harsh, cold, unforgiving light. We dragged the exhausted, weeping client into the bright yellow medical tent and handed him over to the on-site physician without uttering a single word. Sloane collapsed onto a metal folding chair in the staging area, stripping off her wet gloves. Her hands were heavily bruised, her hair plastered to her forehead with frozen sweat. She looked at her watch, her chest heaving as she pulled thin oxygen into her burning lungs. We beat the launch, she whispered, leaning her head back against the canvas wall. I did not sit down. I walked to the portable communications terminal on the metal desk. I logged into the secure company network using my administrative credentials. I opened a new document template. I began typing rapidly with my left hand, keeping my injured right arm immobilized tightly against my side to stem the bleeding. I compiled the GPS telemetry data, the atmospheric pressure logs, the time-stamped records of the client's ignored warnings, and the exact physics calculations proving his deliberate deviation from the marked route. I attached the encrypted ping data from my personal device, proving the extraction was conducted independently, without utilizing a single Apex corporate resource. I turned the chaotic, near-fatal nightmare into an impenetrable fortress of numerical fact. I hit print. The laser printer hummed loudly, spitting out 10 pages of dense, irrefutable data. I stacked the papers, aligned the edges perfectly, and stapled them. I turned around. Sloane was watching me. "What is that?" she asked, her voice raspy. "The after-action report," I replied, holding out the heavy packet. "It details client 402's gross negligence. Present this to the board at 0800 hours. It strengthens Apex's defense and strips Vance of a clean negligence narrative." She stood up slowly and took the packet. Her fingers brushed lightly against mine. She looked down at my shredded sleeve, staring at the dark blood seeping through the thermal fabric. "You did all of this as a private citizen," she noted, looking back up at my face. "Because I fired you." "Correct. I am currently unemployed. You risked a permanent physical injury to hold that line for a man who insulted you? A calculated risk. The structural integrity of my bone mass held. The distance between us was less than a foot. I kept my hands firmly at my sides, suppressing an illogical, highly inefficient urge to reach out and wipe a streak of dirt from her pale cheek. "I do not touch my employers." "Tadio," she said, her voice dropping all corporate pretense, leaving only the profound exhaustion and the truth. "Why did you do it?" I looked at her. I considered the acceptable, professional answers. Loyalty to the brand, duty to human life, professional pride in my flawless safety record. None of those were empirically true. I chose the hardest honest answer. "Because your grandfather built this company, and it matters to you," I stated, my voice low and steady. "And because I find your presence in my operational environment highly optimal." It was a clunky admission, a machine trying to speak poetry. Sloane's eyes softened. She did not mock my phrasing. She didn't offer a dramatic speech. She just stood there, absorbing the weight of the data I had handed her. "Monday morning, 0800 hours, she said, her tone shifting back to command, but layered with something warm and absolute. "Be at the corporate office. I am fired. Then I am hiring an independent expert witness for the board meeting," she said, turning toward the door. "Don't be late. Monday at 0755, 5 hours. I walked into the Apex Expeditions corporate headquarters. My right forearm was heavily bandaged and concealed beneath a dark, tailored suit jacket. I bypassed the receptionist, walked down the long, glass-walled corridor, and entered the primary boardroom. The room was vast, lined with polished mahogany and heavy glass. 6 board members sat around the long table. Vance Gonzalez sat at the far end, leaning back arrogantly in his leather chair, a smug, victorious expression plastered across his face. Sloane stood at the head of the table, wearing a sharp navy blazer, projecting absolute authority. Vance looked up, his smugness faltering slightly as I entered the room. "What is he doing here? Bennett is an employee. This is a closed executive session regarding the failure on the North Ridge." "Mr. Bennett is not an employee," Sloane corrected, her voice carrying across the quiet room with lethal calm. "He is an independent contractor who operated in a private capacity over the weekend. He's the reason client 402 almost died," Vance argued loudly, slapping a hand on the table, trying to rally the board. His route planning was negligent. The weather window was missed. "I'm moving for an immediate vote of no confidence in your leadership, Sloane, and the immediate sale of the company assets." I walked to the center of the table. I did not wait for an invitation to speak. I placed the 10-page data report directly in front of the board chairman. I placed a secondary flash drive containing the raw telemetry next to it. "Client 402 ignored 4 documented turnaround protocols," I stated, my voice flat, carrying the acoustic resonance of absolute certainty. "He deviated from the planned route by 300 meters into a high-risk avalanche zone. My planning was mathematically flawless. His execution was flawed. The extraction was conducted off company time, using private equipment. Apex Expeditions incurred 0 liability." The chairman picked up the report, adjusting his glasses. He scanned the timestamps and the GPS overlays. The data was irrefutable. It didn't erase the risk. Legal would still vet it, but it stripped Vance of his clean narrative. "Furthermore," I continued, looking directly at Vance, "the client has signed a non-disclosure agreement and a waiver of liability, acknowledging his own fault after reviewing these exact calculations at base camp. No clean lawsuit. No easy PR angle. No negligence narrative he can sell." The room remained entirely quiet. The sound of the HVAC system pushing air through the ceiling vents was the only noise. Vance's face turned a mottled, angry red. He looked at the chairman, but the older man was already nodding, sliding the report into his leather folder. "Well documented, Mr. Bennett," the chairman said softly. Sloane stepped forward. She did not look at her brother. She looked at the board. "The crisis is resolved. The motion for the sale to the conglomerate is canceled. We remain independent." She turned to face me. The entire room watched her. She could have thanked me, dismissed me, and maintained the corporate hierarchy. She could have offered me a quiet bonus. "Effective immediately," Sloane announced, her eyes locked on mine. "Tadeo Bennett is reinstated. He'll lead field ops with full board oversight, and I'm putting my name behind his work." She placed a formal, printed contract on the table between us. She didn't frame it as a command or a possession. She framed it as a partnership. "The offer is in writing, Mr. Bennett. You retain the right of refusal without penalty," she said, her voice steady. I looked at the contract. Then I looked at her. She didn't step back. She stayed in my space, holding her ground, like she'd decided the math could include 2 people. My shoulders finally dropped. For the first time all night, my hands stopped shaking from the cold. "Terms accepted," I said. When I unlocked the duplex later that evening, the ambient temperature was a steady 64 degrees. The house was quiet. I walked down the hall and opened the door to the second bedroom. Leo was fast asleep under his down quilt, his breathing rhythmic and untroubled. I walked into the kitchen. Mrs. Higgins had left the kettle warm on the stove, alongside a small, yellow sticky note on the counter. "He didn't even stir. Left the back door unlocked for your guest. See you next time." I heard the quiet click of the deadbolt sliding into place from the entryway. I turned around. Sloane was standing in my hallway. She'd swapped into a dry, heavy knit, something built for warmth, not appearances. She looked exhausted, but the rigid tension in her shoulders was completely gone. I didn't ask why she was there. I reached for the kettle, pouring the hot water over a fresh measure of loose-leaf Earl Grey tea. I set the mug on the counter. She walked over, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic. She slid the mug toward me like an offering. I didn't take her hand, just stood close enough to share the heat. She looked up at me, her eyes reflecting the dim, overhead light. The temperature in here is perfect, she whispered. It is calibrated, I replied. The end. Closing thoughts, I learned love looks like a steady hand on the mug and a contract that respects your freedom. Real love isn't a power struggle or a dramatic rescue. It's consistent safety, clear boundaries, and showing up when the weather turns cold. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.